So SRPP, social responsible public procurement, basically is the idea that public procurement contracts, be it of goods, service, or works, could be used to thrive, to strive, to purchase, to pursue elements, social benefits, or a social impact. So it could be in that sense, it could be directive. If you talk about SRPP, you are talking about green, circular, innovative procurement. This means, of course, that if you talk about at the same time being strategic, being green, being circular, being innovative, this means that you need to have a policy or a political commitment, or on a high level of the administration, a commitment, and you need to have the support of those who have to execute, who have to launch the call for tenders, who have to follow up on the procurement. So this means civil servant support. Next slide. Key issues in SRPP. It's not about, or it's not always only about the lowest price. Procurement is also about securing jobs and employment, but you have to respect the basic principles of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, of course. Ensure fair wages, working conditions, social protection, equal treatment, gender equality, social dialogue, if possible, and the safeguarding of the rights at work. And we saw a development in public procurement over the decennia. And I remember that it started in the 1990s. And I remember one of the first cases, just as an example, was a case of a contract of works in France, I think it was in Lille. And the idea was to launch a contract to modernize a suburban area. And they wanted to get the people living there involved in the project. And so how they did it was that they said, well, we want the contractor, if he gets the contract, that a percentage of his employees come from the unemployed people living in that suburban area. And this was one of the first cases. It went before the European Court. And the court said, well, this is acceptable as long, of course, if you have this idea of proportionality. And so this was something that was more and more developed. It was enlarged with all the elements of SRPP, but it was a good example. It started in the 90s, and now 30 years later, we have all these elements that we can take into account as long as they are not wrongfully used to protect, of course, elements in a wrongful way. Cannot be something that you would use to favorize a company, favorize a contractor, or favorize a national company. In that case, of course, it is not acceptable. Next slide. So if we want to apply this, there are many ways to include this. You have your mandatory legislation in the member states. This is, of course, applicable, but aside of that, you could also make a reference to things that are not mandatory. And so two elements that can be mentioned especially. First of all, is the possibility in public procurement contracts to use the social economy or social enterprises. So you have in the public procurement legislation, in the public procurement directives, you have the possibility to reserve your contract. So reserved contracts are contracts, and you see the reference to the legislation on the slide. A reserved contract is a contract where only social enterprises can participate on your call for tender. And a social enterprise, according to our national laws, is an enterprise who, in his statutes, stipulates that it will also pay attention to social elements and not only to a lucrative purpose of the company. The use of lots, we talked about it. You could also make a reference to the International Labour Organization or to the UNCRPD on the accessibility and design of what you are or what you want to obtain in your contract. Human rights seems to be logical. There was a case where regarding fair trade, Netherlands versus the Commission, where there was a discussion about the use of fair trade considerations in the procurement elements, and the Commission said, the court said that it is something that can be used. Next slide. So the essential elements is you have to put it on the official agenda, but I think it's something that that is more reality than something that should be done. Once it's on the official agenda and there's a political awareness, then you have to define the objective, translate your indicators into elements mentioned in your call for tenders. What could be very interesting or necessary even, and bear in mind what Harold will tell you, and I think also the case of Arnhem could be interesting, is that if you want to launch a public procurement contract that has significant differences with how you did the public procurement contracts before, then stakeholder consultations are essential. And stakeholder consultations is not only with your clients, your internal clients, but is also with the potential contractors. Because if you don't do that, you risk to have bids that contain flaws, or in the worst case, no bids at all. And so if there are significant changes in the way you do your public procurement, you have to make sure that your stakeholders are on board. And this doesn't mean that you favorize them, that you favorize some contractors. It simply means that you make sure that everybody is on board on the way you want to process, be it on a social element, a green element, an innovative element, or whatever you may have. It also means that once you start using or once you start inserting these elements in your public procurement contracts, that there is a monitoring and a reviewing process. So to make sure that if you have to adapt, that you can adapt. If you have to improve, you have to change, maybe you have to stop some things, that you can do this on time. So the European Union Commission did a lot of development, wrote a couple of documents on the use of toolkits on SRPP. You see the link on the slide, and you see two examples of the documents available on the level of the European Commission. Gives a good idea on how to address these items in your public procurement contracts. Next slide. So it starts with the specification. You see here a couple of examples. So supply of hospital uniforms, And in the case of this hospital uniforms, SRPP was introduced by using some selection criteria, by the awarding criteria linked to labels certifying ethical production. Technical specification, where you make sure that the accessibility and the disability induciveness is taken into account. Other examples, I jump to the third one, is the public-private partnership to develop urban area, including social housing, where we saw that in the selection criteria, experience in delivering these kind of projects was taken into account. Specifications requested specifically for accessibility elements, and the contract clauses included the recruitment and training of a certain number of disadvantaged workers. This is a little bit like the example I gave you from Lille, where a same kind of clause was written down in the call for tender documents. Next slide. So you start in the prospection because you want to make sure, of course, that if you start with a new kind of approach on public procurement in SRPP, that your companies in your member state, or even with in other member state, would be able to give you this information to submit a bid according to your call for tender, including SRPP elements. So this could include a PIN. So what is a PIN? A PIN is a prior information notice. It's an official way of letting the market know that you want to do something new, and that the market, before you officially start a public procurement procedure, can react to this novelty. We use lots, we use new systems, we use framework agreements and framework agreement contracts. In our selection and exclusion criteria, you see on the slide some examples of exclusion criteria, so breach of obligations, violations of applicable obligations on the social and environmental clauses, gives you a possibility to exclude companies who do not respect these kind of exclusion clauses. Gender equality, so again, things you can use, but always be aware that once you start writing this down into your call for tender, that you have to respect what you have to apply what you have written down. And so this could create some problems when you want to award the contract, but this is an example of how it was used in Germany. So one of the things that you could use, but again, take into account what the impact could be on your contract. One of the things you could use is the directive on the Accessibility Act that covers product and services that are linked to persons with disabilities. It will enter into force at the latest the 28th of June 2025. And so this means that if it is transposed in time in your member state, that it is something that you will have to take into account from that moment on. But before it is transposed, could be something that you already use in your call for tenders, but it's not mandatory. Okay. So some examples is to make sure that if you have technical specifications on all kinds of computer material, terminals, etc., that you would make sure that it is accessible to all people, also those with disabilities on the services, make sure that something is foreseen for people with disabilities. This means, of course, that in a first step or in a first time lap, that you could have a situation where the cost of your contract becomes more expensive. Because in the beginning, not all bidders would be already able to foresee, to present the services or the type of products that you require. So this could be that in a first time lapse, products or services become more expensive. In time, since it would be something mandatory all over Europe, prices would go down again. But in the first step, it could mean that prices go up. We saw, for example, this in the past when we used a PESC for wood. So you wanted to buy wood, and you wanted to buy wood with an ecological stamp. So you would say, well, we need PESC. That is a label. And this could have an impact, of course, on price. And in the beginning it had. But over time, most of the vendors of wood started also use or conclude PESC into their portfolio, and so then we saw that the price went down again also for PESC.